when we looked at whole school data, your school might have been like this one, where if you look at the overall levels, you find that whereas in this school, the pupils are doing quite well in reading, they're not in writing. So for this school, writing would be an issue. So if that was the case in your school, you might be following down the writing level. What I'm going to do today is look at both reading and writing. So it'll cover both aspects of those. And of course, we've got those interim teacher assessment frameworks, which is specifying in terms of what pupils can do in writing. So when you do your class level data analysis, it should be looking at these kind of things, what they're doing. So the whole school data gives you that headline figure. The class level data starts giving you information about the different aspects of writing at a class level. And if you're in Key Stage 1, you'd be looking at the Key Stage 1 teacher assessment frameworks and so on. And you might be looking at the pre-Key Stage assessment frameworks. You might be looking at early years outcomes and so on. It would depend on your situation in your school. So we've got the working towards, the working at the expected standard, and you've no doubt familiar with these, and I've mentioned them before, and I will be mentioning them again because these come from the 2014 National Curriculum, which is what people are working with now. So I thought I would just try to put it into context by using a bit of a case study, looking at some writing from pupils year 2 to year 6. Now, the RAISE Online data is now available. When we first started the course, I don't think it was published at that particular point in time. And I did talk, I think, at one point at class level data about reading, the difficulties provided because the reading booklets are uploaded now. You don't have the same access to be able to analyse the questions at a question level. Well, in the online, RAISE Online data for each individual schools, it is now giving much more focused detail. And here, what we're seeing with this particular school, and this is around grammar, punctuation, and spelling. And what it's doing is it's saying, these were the marks for this school, and I've chosen this school is because A, I know them and they've given me access to look at their data, and B, because it was a small class, so it fits on the screen really well. But what it's doing is it's showing the marks that were scored for those different areas, what the school percentage was, and what the national percentage was, and what the difference is. So straight away, when we look at this, you can see that you've got some areas where the school is below the national area. Although if you look at their overall results for grammar, punctuation and spelling, they probably match or exceed the national level. So it's looking specifically at these different areas. And you can also break it down in terms of specific questions and areas. So we can actually look at some specifically different questions, like this one, question 23, this one, question 16, and see what they are. So when we look at those specific questions, so you've had the strands part of it, where it says there was an area where the school was achieving less than the national, and now we can actually go in and see what specific questions they were that were being asked in this area. So this is about punctuation marks. So it's asking, what's the name of the punctuation marks on either side of the words, which was a spaniel. And I'd have thought of that was a fairly straightforward question, which was a spaniel. The punctuation marks around them are clearly brackets. And then it says, what's the name of a different punctuation mark that could be used correctly in the same place? Well, this is a relative clause. So there should have been commas around the relative clause. So in this, there's been a problem in this particular school around punctuation marks, and it could be they didn't know brackets, it could be they didn't know that you could put commas there, or it could be both, because there's 2 marks for that, but they've scored less than the national average. And then the other one was 23, where it was less, and in this case, again, it's commas. So perhaps it was commas in the previous one as well. So if you go again, if you look at these, and you have to tick whichever sentence is correct, where the commas are used correctly, and that first one's another one of those relative clauses. So it looks to me as if this school needs to do some teaching about relative clauses and the punctuation of commas around a relative clause. To be absolutely certain, you'd obviously have to look at the pupils' individual outcomes and results. The next one is commas in a list, and that's fairly straightforward as well. The third one is obviously not been used correctly because the comma is in the wrong place, and again with the fourth one as well. So it's commas, and it's commas in both of these. So it's giving an indication of something that could be used to improve the teaching of English, and in this case it's around grammar, punctuation and spelling. And you can also look at the individual scores. So obviously I've taken the pupils' names off here, but you can see when you look at this, across the top you've got the sort of national averages, and then you've got the areas that we're looking at, the specific questions, and we've got this one here that stands out because only one child got that, and it's way below their score is about 14%, which is way below the national average of 40%, 41%. So, and you can also see actually that this one's down a bit, although not necessarily against the national average, but against the other areas the children are scoring in. So you've got 2 areas here that you could pull out and say, okay, we can have a closer look at this and look at the teaching and looking at the pupils' outcomes and what the children are doing. And those 2 areas are exclamations and noun phrases. So you begin to see that the data, rather than just giving you those headline figures of what the school has done compared to nationally or whatever, or the school down the road, and you always say, well, you know, the pupils in my school aren't necessarily the same as the pupils in those schools. But what you can see is you can see patterns emerging where in some areas you're doing better than national average, in some areas you're doing less well. The headline figures will only give you the broad figure, whereas when you start to come down into class level figures, into individual levels, you're seeing the specific things that you need to do if you're going to improve. So we've got here, those are the 2 areas that this pulled up. You've got functions of sentence for this school. It seems that they were different from the national by 4% in functions of sentences. So let's go now to an individual child's writing. So this child's year 2, and the task was to write a set of instructions. And the sheet itself that was used in its way is creating a frame for writing. And if we have a look at what this pupil has written here, it says, I will need, and we've got, I will need slime, I will need eyeballs, I will need green cookies. And what that child's done is written sentences, whereas it's probably not appropriate for this particular task, because normally you'd write a list of things that you need, and you wouldn't be saying I would need. because it wouldn't be appropriate for this kind of writing. But let's look at the positive of this. This child is writing sentences, okay? Not got a full stop at the end, but those sentences, each of them, are statement sentences. They're a statement of what she will need. But I wonder whether that pupil knows that those sentences that she or he has written are statement sentences. And of course, as a program of study, it's about writing for different purposes and sentences with different forms: statement, question, exclamation, and command. So the functions of different sentences. And when we're looking at writing, we need to be clear about what we're looking for, because actually in different genres of writing, you're going to have different things. So in this case, we're writing in the present tense, but we're also writing using the imperative. So typically in instructional writing, the verb comes at the beginning of the sentence. These are command sentences. So this is an example of how we can introduce those different functions of sentence into our writing, and we can look at the writing to see whether they're being used. And if we have a look at Katie's writing, you can see that she's understood that the verb has to go at the beginning of a sentence. She has used the present tense. Put the slime in the bread, get the eyeballs in the bread. She's mostly put full stops at the end of those sentences as well, and capital letters at the beginning, and the teacher's comment here. Now, I think if we're going to use comments on writing, and here what we're doing is we're giving some praise, that's the superstar element, and then we're giving them a point to move on. My wish is. And I always think that things like to check your spellings on the word cards is not going to help move the writing on. It might do something about the spelling, but it's not going to help in terms of the quality of the writing. So I think we need to think very carefully about the comments that we make as well. Because I wonder whether, although Katie has written these command sentences, I wonder whether she knows that they are command sentences. And one simple way of actually helping her with that would be a comment like this. It's still positive, it's still praise, but it's reinforcing that these are command sentences. And if this can be achieved in year 2, then by the time you get to year 6, hopefully you're not seeing that one of the things that needs to be improved is functions of different sentences. Looking here at year 3-4 class, and this exercise was about writing interesting sentence openings. So again, this is about writing an interesting sentence, and a book had been used to model what an interesting sentence opening might look like. And the year, you probably can't read this, but I'm just going to focus on one sentence here. The shining moon glowed on the glassy egg. And this is kind of quite typical of a sentence that I see where work has been done around adjectives, descriptions to make them more interesting. But if we look at the sentence itself, the shining moon glowed on the glassy egg, it might be helping move towards developing some noun phrases, but it isn't really developed enough for that. It's still basically a one-clause sentence. So it's about what are we going to do? How are we going to move that on? Because we seem to move away from just focusing on putting more interesting words in there and looking at adjectives, but actually thinking about making the sentences more complex, because that's the scores. The better writers are the ones that are writing sentences that have more than one clause in them. And if you have a look at the programs of study, they do talk about extending the range of sentences with more than one clause. And it tells you how to do that by using a wider range of conjunctions, and it gives you some advice. So lower key stage 2, when, if, because, although, and using a wide range of devices to build cohesion within and across paragraphs. Cohesion, what does it mean? So it's about the grammatical features which help the parts fit together in the text. And one way of creating cohesion is through the use of connectives. So both words and phrases used can link different parts of the text, and it gives an example there. And it also says it's often used, it's often achieved by the use of words such as pronouns that refer to other parts of the text as well. So, and it gives some example of cohesive devices as well. So we've got determinism, pronouns, conjunctions, adverbs, and ellipsis, and so on. And obviously it depends on the age of the pupils as to how far you're going to stretch that out. But we need to start thinking about how we're going to move that year 4 pupil to writing sentences with more than one clause, paragraphs that have cohesive devices and link it together. This is also a year 4 pupil here, and I want to look at that sentence there, which says George wanted to know where the egg came from. And of course, it should be, for a start, where the egg came from. But the biggest problem with it is that it's got a question mark there. This is a statement sentence. George wanted to know where the egg came from. That is a statement, but it's got a question mark. So again, an example of this pupil isn't clear about those different functions of sentences. And that comes in to year 2. So we saw it with Katie, who was using it in the case of, she was using command sentences in the case of procedural writing, but probably didn't know explicitly that they were command sentences. So using cohesion isn't anything particularly new. We've had these around for a while. How can we do that? So we can have paragraph sections which help to organize the content. So when you have an activity that is about putting a lot of sentences down, which those 2 examples came from that class where they were just sentences and they were written looking as if it was a paragraph, but in fact it was just a series of different sentences, because that's what they've been asked to do, write an interesting opener for a sentence. Perhaps a better task might have been write an interesting opening sentence and make some notes about what else you could put in that paragraph, because we've got to move pupils on. And also varying sentences so that vary the length, the structure, the subject, and again, connectives and using tense and verb forms. And again, this is the noun phrase bit coming, so elaborated by adverbial and expanded noun phrases. So sentences that might have more than one clause, but they might have one clause and one expanded noun phrase in there. And again, looking at a year 6 sample of writing, and this was a middle ability pupil in year 6, and their task was to write a mini saga, and it was based on a topic on Victorians where the class had been learning about the workhouse. And so I find this a little bit confusing, because I don't know what a mini saga is in the sense of, I mean, I know what they're intending it to do, but a saga traditionally is a form of writing, which is a saga, it's a long one. And this was an exercise to précis, to get down a saga in just 50 words. And again, I'm not sure of how helpful the task is for pupils in terms of improving their writing, because if you have a look at this particular piece of writing and listen to the sentences, there was only one place poor Tom could go, and that was the workhouse. Poor Tom was only 11 years old, and he was expected to make things with extremely huge machinery. He thought it was terrible. He only got one meal a day, and that was like watery porridge. And what you can see is this pupil is writing sentences that are actually, the structure of them is very similar. So if we have a look at looking at what you're going to be looking for in a piece of writing, and we're looking for paragraphs to organise ideas, describing settings and characters, possibly if it's appropriate, some cohesive devices within and across sentences and paragraphs, and using different verb forms mostly accurately, and using coordinating and subordinating conjunctions. So if we go back to that piece of writing and have a look at that, you can see that the range of conjunctions being used is quite limited, and the sentences are remaining single clause sentences. So if you want this pupil to move on and improve their writing, they need to write some more extended sentences, and in some ways it's not that it's a bad piece of writing. He's got a nice short sentence there. He thought it was terrible, and he's using some pronouns, but you can see that it needs to be improved if you're going to get those higher marks.